everybody's got to remember, freedom isn't free. You got to fight for it.
John A. Davidson, World War II veteran, entered the service with a feeling of invincibility. He was only 18 years old.
Figured I could whip the world, and I never worried about it.
Out of the 48 people in his high school graduating class, all but 2 or 3 served in World War II. John Davidson decided to join the Navy Air Corps.
And they asked for volunteers for air crew, and I volunteered to be an aerial gunner, and there went on for further training.
His most vivid memory of boot camp does not involve training itself.
The thing I remember the most is I arrived at Great Lakes on a Saturday morning, and we had breakfast that was not very appetizing. It was kind of a meat, ground up meat served on toast. We had a name for it, which I'm not able to use.
Besides that, he had a positive outlook on his training experience. John Davidson traveled the U.S. for various types of training. He went to boot camp at the Great Lakes, aviation ordnance school at Norman, Oklahoma, aerial gunnery school at Tulsa, Oklahoma, and operational flight training at Fort Lauderdale, Florida.
Well, boot camp was not too bad. It was a lot of marching and drilling. I grew up on a farm about Atterbury, Illinois, which is north of Petersburg, or New Salem State Park for people who are not acquainted with Petersburg. And I had hunted all my life, so when it came to the rifle practice and that, it was right down my alley. And then in the aviation ordnance school, I was always interested in guns, and there's where we were trained in at the armed aircraft. And then I volunteered for flight duty, and I went through aerial gunnery school, and then went to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, where I joined the squadron.
In addition to his mindset that he could do anything, John Davidson was already accustomed to the way of life he experienced in the military.
I was used to getting up early. The fact is, when I went, I was a hired hand on the farm at $30 a month and paid my own food and own rent and medical. The Navy clothed me, fed me, and looked at it, dressed me, gave me $30 a month. Thought I was in heaven.
However, being in a war was not always pleasant. In John Davidson's unit, a fear always existed that you would be one of the many that didn't make it home.
Yeah, in my unit, the odds were 4 out of 5 out of torpedo bombing crew weren't going to get back. And we pretty much ran the same thing, not so much from combat, but we lost a lot of pilots and crew due to crashes and training. We started out with 75 in October of 43. I think it was 75. We wound up at the end of the war 20 or 25.
After completing his training, John Davidson was ready to enter the war as an ordnance man.
I was a tail gunner. A torpedo bomber had a 3-man crew: a pilot, a gunner, and a radioman, radar man, who served as a tail gunner underneath the plane. Towards the end of the war, we had 5-inch underwing rockets, which the pilot controlled, but I had a 50 caliber machine gun, which I controlled, and the radioman had a 30 caliber. But ordnance man was responsible for arming and looking after all the guns and all the bombs and the fuses and the whole ramification of armament.
The skills John Davidson acquired through flight training were essential early on when he was in his first and only air-to-air combat.
Our first actual real combat that I was in was right on Clark Airfield in early November of 44, where I had my only air-to-air combat, where I and the the wingman. I was in a wing, and he was in the other wing. Shared a zero between us. We the only air-to-air combat we had. The rest of it was all ground free.
Although he was only engaged in air-to-air combat one time, his most memorable experience occurred while performing air-to-sea missions.
Well, probably one of the most vivid was two. One was when we sank a heavy cruiser with a torpedo. There was six torpedoes hit the Jap heavy cruiser, and it was afloat, and it rolled right over from the torpedoes going off. And the other was at Ormoc Bay, which is on the other side of Lady Island, which from where the invasion began. And the task force, the air groups in the task force raided a Japanese armada group of ships. There was 11 ships when we peeled off to make the attack, and when we pulled up out of the air group pulled up, the whole task force, third fleet, there wasn't a ship afloat.
All of the flights John Davidson participated in were recorded in his flight book. It kept a running list of all flights from training until the squadron was disbanded. This log was turned in to calculate his pay.
There's a record of the flights. I had 300 and some odd hour air time. To qualify in the Navy for flight pay, you had to fly at least 4 hours a month. And being in the flight crew gave you a bonus of pay. You got 50% flight pay. When you were on a carrier, you got 20% flight sea pay. Then we got 10% sea pay. And then since I was in over 3 years and got a good conduct medal, I got 5% for that. So when the war ended in 45, I was getting 85% of my base pay on as bonus.
Another thing that affected his pay was his rank. He improved his rating throughout his time in the service.
I got third class, was the first strike after I graduated from ordnance school, and I got second class when I was in operational training, and first class I was promoted within the Navy from the first to the second to the third class. Third class was when we were back from combat and formed the squadron around us. So many of the veterans, or old timers as they called us, even though I was 20 years old, to form a nucleus of a new squadron. And then when the war ended, it disbanded, but I was promoted and I behaved myself, so I didn't get any trouble.
Staying out of trouble gave John Davidson a good rapport with his comrades along with the officers he served with. He established good relationships with many people he met in the war.
Got along with the officers very well. I had close contact with two. One was Clyde Grove, who was my first pilot. And then when we reformed the squadron in May of 45, I got Bill Hunt, who had been the pilot of another crew while we were in combat.
John Davidson also had the good fortune to be in a unit that was considerably well supplied, so that was seldom a worry.
Yeah, well, the only time we was short on supplies was when we were in the typhoon in December of 44, when it lasted for 3 days, and 3 United States destroyers capsized because the flight deck of a carrier was 80 feet out of the water, and the waves were so big that it was breaking over the bow of the ship. And we had 3 destroyers that ran out of fuel and broadsided and capsized. That's the only time we got a little short on supplies. Other than that, we were well supplied.
Therefore, being well supplied resulted in successful raids such as that in Iwo Jima and Tokyo.
Well, the one combat two combats that I enjoyed, that I remember, was we flew air cover on the first wave of Marines that hit Iwo Jima. And Iwo Jima looked like a moonscape. It had been bombed and shelled, and the only thing was volcanic dust. It wasn't a living thing or a building or shred of anything above ground. It was all below ground. And when we raided Tokyo, we were in the first Navy raid on Tokyo in February of '45. The clouds were lower than the peak of Mount Fujiyama, and we were arriving and seeing this cone of stone up through the clouds impressed me to no end.
Another impressive aspect of John Davidson's story is the medals he was awarded over the course of his military service.
Yeah, I have an American Theater combat, which was the Caribbean and sea area of the world, and the Pacific, and Philippine Island campaign, Good Conduct Medal, and Air Medal, which was awarded to me for being on the air crew when we sank the heavy cruiser.
John Davidson was on a crew that sunk a heavy cruiser, but he also had an experience where he was on the other end of the spectrum. He was on deck when the Ticonderoga was hit by two kamikazes.
We took two kamikaze pilots in January of '45, January 21st, '45, which stay in my memory forever. And we saved the ship after we were ordered to ban, because we were caught us at the most vulnerable time, because we were headed into the wind to launch the planes, and the planes were all loaded with gasoline and armor and bombs, when the guy went through the flight deck and exploded on the hangar deck, and they had an instant fireball. And then the second one hit us in the forecastle, and it brings back memories when I think of it.
When the attack happened, John Davidson and his other crew members were on board preparing for a different mission.
I was in the radio room, the air crew radio room, which is right under the flight deck, getting ready to take off for a raid on, we were between Formosa and Luzon, and I think we were going to go to Formosa, which is now known as Taiwan.
After the attack, John Davidson was forced to come face to face with an even bigger enemy, the sea.
I think the hardest part was when we took two suicides. I can't swim, and we were ordered to man ship. I had a close buddy that could swim, so I stayed right alongside of him doing all the time. We were battling the fires on the carrier. But overall, I got along very well.
Apart from day-to-day combat, John Davidson did have some downtime where he could relax by means of entertainment or simply resting. Men were also given leave at set periods of time where they would participate in training and other activities such as Liberty. He remembers 3 times when he was given leave. Once right after boot camp, the second in January of 1945 before winter training, and the third in June before shipping out to the Pacific. John Davidson's service in the Navy came to an end permanently in the spring of 1946.
I don't remember the exact day. It was in April of '46. I got discharged in San Diego and rode back with a civilian that was going back to Detroit from San Diego to Petersburg, Illinois, which was my home. My mother moved to town from the farm when my brother and I were both in service. Everybody was friendly and joyful and pleased to see you got back alive. There was none of this stuff that went on like Vietnam.
Upon his return, John Davidson experimented with several occupations before finding one he ultimately pursued through further schooling.
Well, I loafed for 30 days, and then went to work for the state at New Salem State Park, and then got tonsil infection, and then I shot dynamite at a 8th and Stone quarry, and then when they closed down for the winter, I went to work for Al's-Chalmers for about 6 weeks, decided I wasn't cut out to be a factory worker, and went to work for Truckaway Corporation. And I suffered from migraine headaches, and one of them hit me was I was taking a pair of new trucks to Clovis, New Mexico, and my squadron wingman, Dr. Homer Stallings, was a senior intern at Carver Chiropractic College in Oklahoma City, and I pulled in and called him, and because the only thing I knew what to do was get a shot of morphine. And he took me back in the clinic and examined me and adjusted me, and dawned on me later on that I didn't have a headache. So I switched from being, I enrolled at Stanford University to be a petroleum geologist. I was just waiting to go to school. And I switched and went to chiropractic college. And then after one semester there, I knew I was coming back to Illinois, and it wasn't recognized by Illinois, so I transferred to National College in Chicago and I was a chiropractic physician for 41 years, and county board member 13 and a half, and a member of the Illinois State Senate for 20 years.
John Davidson was fortunate to make it through the war with a positive outlook, just as we were fortunate to have the opportunity to hear his story.
I appreciate very much this interview, and after I talked about the first time due to my kids coming home from history class, I've been able to talk about it. Up till then, I was pretty quiet.
John Davidson's story, like so many others, is one that should always be remembered. His actions are worthy of respect from all. After learning about John Davidson's experiences, we have a greater appreciation for those who have served our country throughout history. In his own words, freedom isn't free, you have to fight for it. We would like to thank all those who have done that and have preserved our freedom. We are grateful for the courage that World War II veterans showed in their time of service. We sincerely appreciate the time that John Davidson gave us to tell us his story.